The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you for joining us for this session, Getting to Zero Buildings Count and Trends for 2019. I am Connie Umphris, Communications Manager at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear our speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know, and we will help you as we go. Please ask questions in the same question pane as they come up. We will have time to ask questions at the end of the presentation. At the end of the session, you will also be given the opportunity to take a short survey. Please take a moment to answer the questions as it helps shape upcoming events. This session is being recorded, and the link to the recording and a PDF of the slides will be sent to all registrants in a follow-up email tomorrow. I'd like to introduce today's speakers, starting with our guest presenter, Clay Nessler. Clay is the Vice President, Global Sustainability and Regulatory Affairs for the Building Technologies and Solutions business of Johnson Controls. He also chairs the company's Global Sustainability Council. Since joining Johnson Controls in 1983, Clay has held a variety of leadership positions in research, product development, marketing, strategy, and corporate sustainability in both the United States and Europe. Kathy Higgins, NBI's research director, will be reporting today on the latest zero energy research. Kathy oversees the portfolio of our leading edge research work here, involving ZE buildings, measured performance, and emerging technology. Starting off today's presentation and introducing NBI's new online tool a little later is Alexi Miller, Senior Project Manager here at NBI. Alexi applies his expertise on building operations and mechanical systems to study building energy use data and synthesize the results into actionable measures for design teams and operation managers. Alexi, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Connie. So just a quick moment to introduce New Buildings Institute. NBI is a 20-year-old nonprofit, and we are delivering advanced thinking on energy efficiency with solutions that can be effectively applied today. Our theory of change includes setting a vision and defining a path forward. We then create the research that serves as the basis for the guidance, tool, and policy development necessary to create market change. Today's agenda, Kathy is going to start us off with an overview of what's going on in the zero energy buildings market with a look at definitions and a good amount of interesting content on the data and the trends that are she'll be characterizing the trends in the zero energy buildings market. Clay is then gonna give us an overview of the findings from the 2018 Johnson Controls Energy Efficiency Indicators Study, which is a fascinating piece there. And then I will take it back to give everyone an overview of the new Getting to Zero Buildings database, live online interactive tool that puts the database NBI holds of zero energy buildings, the Getting to Zero Buildings database, at your fingertips. And then we'll go to a Q&A period at the end. So, Kathy, I'm going to go ahead and pass you keyboard and mouse control, and you should be able to begin.
Thank you very much. Connie, just confirm audio.
Yes.
Thank you, or Alexi, great. Although there we go, and advancement. So, click to ahead there. Well, we're beginning this session on zero energy buildings. I want to acknowledge that we have just an impressive registration list, hundreds of different organizations representing potentially up to 400 people, 400 or 500 people that registered for this event. And I know from being on webinars myself that there's just a great wealth of knowledge out there that's being shared through this great medium that's so much easier to attend and gain knowledge from. So, but I also know that we get distracted. We do multiple things during webinars. So nod your head if you think you're going to do maybe more than just listen to this webinar while you're spending this hour. I see a lot of information there. So I'm going to challenge you right now, an hour from now, to get 3 takeaways from this session and these speakers and this information, 3 new pieces of information, and then to share it this afternoon with a colleague. Use the knowledge you gain here to reiterate it, and that really embodies it in your own knowledge set and then spreads the knowledge in our industry. So there's my challenge for the hour, make it your own. So I want to start with definitions. The name game has been going on for quite a while. We've had zero net energy terms for over 15 years, but I just want to clarify the ones that we're using in today's presentation are these ones right here, which I'm about to define for you. So in our presentation and in the national dialogue around zero energy, the zero energy building terminology has been adopted formally by Department of Energy. Many of us worked on a national committee working towards what definition would be hopefully somewhat universal to reduce market confusion, and zero energy building was selected, and it's defined as a highly energy efficient building that meets 100% or more of its annual energy from renewables. Looking at the attendees that were signed up for this event, I assume a lot of you are very familiar with that. And then within that, there's some definitions NBI has been using for over a decade, which is emerging buildings are those that are targeting zero energy. They could be in many phases. We want in our research to gather everybody that's talking about ZE buildings, planning them, committed to them in budget, in design, construction, and especially the great wealth of them, as you'll see in a minute, that have yet to document that they've achieved a year or more of annual energy use that was met completely by renewables. There's a big market piece of information by just particularly looking at the trends of adoption of ZE targets. And then verified buildings have given us their data, and we've reviewed it and documented that it was reasonable, accurate, and that it met the performance definition above. We have a third definition in the list that we're sharing through this webinar, and that's certified. And that's when a third party other than NBI has certified it. And that is typically living buildings through the ILFI, International Living Futures Institute, and now US Green Buildings Council also has a zero certification. So you'll see these terms emerging and verified in just a moment. And lastly, to understand that when we talk about the energy performance of these buildings, we're talking in kilo BTUs per square foot per year. That's the most common metric, and it's expressed as an energy use intensity. So EUI, when you see that on performance, that's meaning the sum of all fuels, not just electric, translated into BTUs and looked at on an annual square footage basis. All right, so let's look at some data. We've been doing this research since 2010, and we published our first report in 2012, listing 60 buildings that we were pretty astonished to find 60 buildings. And as we moved along with kind of a biannual release of these studies in order to publish them more formally, you see the growth in the counts for each year. And last year we did the 2018, and these reports are more in depth and present information like we're talking about today. But we are also now looking at doing updates of just the counts and some of the key figures, and especially what Alexi will talk about in terms of the facility we now have with our online tool to generate data and share the list, and for you to access the list more dynamically as it updates. So we're proud to say that we're nearly at 600 buildings, and you see here the terminology I referred to before, where the blue section in the graph shows the trend in emerging being so much greater than verified, because there's a lot more buildings entering the market, hitting this target, or proceeding through their operation period, and either they have achieved zero energy and we haven't been able to get the information, or they're still striving for that goal. A very low energy building is equally as good as one that crosses this line that's ever moving of zero. So that's the trends in zero energy and verified, the percentages of those 580 buildings. So let's look at some of the information about those buildings. We contain it as well in regional watch lists. You see California, the Northwest, a school-specific watch list, and our most recent New York getting to zero status report. So we're trying to move the market. All of us on this call probably have an agenda to advance both buildings and the carbon and decarbonization policies that we're trying to advance to reduce the impact of generation of electricity and fuels. through these buildings that are responsible for a large part of greenhouse gas emissions, and getting regional, getting local. That's what this is all about. So you go from the national list that we're sharing today to regional lists that we can create for different parties to the exact names of the buildings. When you go and talk to a client or you're looking for a building in your area, the list is by name, by location, by size. So it lets you cut it a lot of different ways, as Alexi will show you. And these buildings throughout North America are now in every state except for 5, and we're looking forward to when we can fill this map completely in due to people like yourselves in those regions. We just added North Dakota. Attaboy, North Dakota, way to go. And we have the Canadian provinces, and we have this 580 buildings distributed across every climate zone in North America. So whereas previously it was early adopters were in very easy to accomplish mild climates, look at the Southeast here, and where the region that's hot and humid, always a challenging environment, is accomplishing zero energy buildings. Another way that we've recently cut it is just this box type diagram. And it's nice because it shows the proportionality. And whereas California naturally is a large proportion, 44% of the buildings are in California, you see that distribution is getting much more even into regions. And another thing that the colors denote is these regions, both in terms of Midwest, Southeast, Northeast, and aligned with the terms down here in this box here, which refer to the regional energy organizations that operate in those areas. In order to advance our objectives, we work with a lot of partners, and you need to too. And these regional energy efficiency organizations have a lot of resources that help move the needle on low energy buildings as well. So in the size part of how we look at the buildings, at the beginning, a lot of the buildings were smaller. Now we're seeing an uptick in terms of larger buildings, where we have a very significant proportion of the buildings over 50,000 square feet. That's a good market trend because larger buildings do tend to be owned somewhat proportionally a little bit more greater amount of private sector buildings, whereas the smaller demonstration buildings early on were often public or nonprofits or small university demonstration projects. So we're getting a much greater diversity of size representing the market distribution. Here in the types of buildings, this is always the most important characteristic, is to say, can you show me a building like I'm going to build? Can you show me a building that is replicable, that I thought was too challenging to get to zero because of their energy intensity or their program or their the technologies that are common. We've seen a growth here with arrows indicating in multifamily. That would have been a market that I would have thought would be one of the later adopters, and yet developers and affordable housing government entities have been moving their multifamily portfolio a little bit towards zero energy, getting those public spaces and the units that are occupied by the tenants into zero energy, both at new construction, and it's noteworthy to say that about 25% of this whole portfolio is renovations, buildings that have been modified to get to zero energy out of renovation or major upgrade. But of course, we do know that education was the first out of the gate and is still a dominant building type with 35% of all the buildings. And down below, you see the breakout in terms of what types of educational buildings. It should have been an early adopter. It's a really critical change agent in our society because every person interacts with an education building through their children, through their community. They're being used for a wider range of uses year round now. Great catalyst to other building types. I want to give a shout out to our friends at ASHRAE and other parties that have been involved in the Advanced Energy Design Guides, because they have a new zero energy K through 12 schools guide that's being used to set the design practices for schools to get to zero energy at new construction. So those are easily found and free online through ASHRAE. This trend in terms of which parts of these buildings are owned by public sector and private sector is also important. We've always had a proportionality of both players, but we are seeing an increase in terms of private for-profits compared to some of the other characteristics of the market divisions of public versus private. And so now that we have 27% of the buildings that are private for-profit and another 19% that are private. We have a greater amount of buildings that we can get the business case from, that we can talk to private sector, and we can say that it's not a financial barrier if these other like type buildings are able to make a business case internally for their pro formas financially. How low can they go is what I used to call this slide. It's pretty amazing to me with 20 some years in this industry to see buildings that are now operating and operating beautifully with indoor environments that are better than a standard building at less than a bit more than half the energy savings of a standard building in our society. And still, even though we've driven codes, rightfully so, to really great codes, the best code in the country, these are still over 40% less than these very progressive and leading edge codes. So when somebody says we've shaved everything we can off with the codes, I've gone as far as I can get, you can just show them this and show them 500 some buildings that are beating that by twice. Really great piece of data. So in summary of what I was just showing you, this would be a good takeaway for you to have, that we've got the location distribution across states and provinces and climate zones. We got 25% of the projects, which of course, because they're large, they're really dominating the floor space area, are greater than 50,000 square feet. In terms of types, I didn't mention on that slide, but there are over 70 different building types, but 74% of those fall into these three building types that were early out of the gate and are still the predominant type. But as we get this diversity, we'll grow in other areas. And lastly, that the private sector growth is now 46%. People always ask, what are the common technologies? I'm not going to read these technologies, but the real takeaway here is that all these buildings have used things that are off the shelf, market ready. The big takeaway in zero energy is not necessarily technologies, although it is important to get the highest performance. There's some key approaches that have to do with separating ventilation air from heating and cooling, perhaps reducing ductwork, high efficiency glazing. I mean, those are there, but they're available. The big key is that the design team takes the goal on early. The owner either indicates it in the spec for the building, or the design team advocates for it and shows them how to get there. And these buildings happen because the design team iterates the design into an affordable program that can meet lower energy close to or at the same budget as was originally planned, hopefully. So I've taken a little different cut today at case studies. I'm just going to show you a couple of buildings. And instead of showing you specific buildings, I've decided to approach it in terms of a few snapshots on groups of buildings, for instance, hospitals. Here's a portfolio of hospitals, Gunderson Health Systems in La Crosse, Wisconsin, who, instead of talking about a single building, I want to point out that they've taken a target of their entire campus, 45 new and existing buildings, representing 2.5 million square feet, and they're going to get their whole portfolio to zero energy. They've also done a very critical that we cannot be in the health industry and be having buildings that are the antithesis of our own objective in our industry. So they measure these emission metrics and the change in those due to the upgrades, operational changes, and eventual new construction of zero energy buildings, and how much they're reducing those due to their own outcomes. And in this bottom right corner, you see that 5% of all the energy use in the country is associated with hospitals, high energy use area. They have buildings that have come down from the 300 to 400 EUIs into the mid hundreds. That's a very impressive energy use intensity for a hospital. Similar, another very leading organization and corporation is United Therapeutics in Silver Springs, Maryland. They have both their Silver Springs, Maryland campus. Again, this is just one building example. In this case, the Unisphere building, their newest zero energy building. Incredible teaching building, incredible forward facing to people who are having their interaction there at the building. And it's a laboratory. So again, a high energy use intensity building. And they also have a building down here at the Mayo Clinic on the bottom left at Jacksonville, Florida, that's designed for both carbon and energy neutrality. And Kaiser Permanente, again, national leader in healthcare, also already has moved forward with zero energy buildings with the Integral Group, who saved them $1 million off the budget they planned for this building by doing that iterative design, changing the HVAC approach, and doing trade-offs for an all-electric building, bringing it into a more efficient HVAC system and reducing the total project cost by $1 million. If you haven't heard that story, ask someone at Integral Group to tell you about it. I love that story. Likewise, speculative office buildings, another group of buildings. I'm just really getting bullish on the findings I can get around private sector developers and the corporations I just talked about, who are making the business rationale to get their good return through these types of buildings. On the left, India Way in California, that renovated a really doggy, typical split mall kind of office building in Sunnyvale, California, retrofitted it to zero energy. Yes, it cost them more to do that renovation. Yes, they netted almost $4 more a square foot in their net cash flow, and they're operating, as you see, at -15, which is a net positive PVs. And over here on the right, my friend Andy Bush out in Boulder, he did a very innovative, interesting integrated the PVs on the roof and the facade to meet his low energy, first driving the energy down, and thus his amount of solar, he got nearly about 85% of the same amount of solar on the vertical plane as he did on the horizontal plane. And he was able to create a creative lease whereby the tenant return on that lease and meeting regular utility like type bills, he's getting an excellent cash on return, and now he's replicating this in other areas of Boulder in private development. And lastly, on these case studies, corporations, portfolios, Alexi knows very well, as does Clay and many of you on the phone, that it's not a single building. Sometimes you have adjacent buildings. You can use the entire site to create a solar farm, if you will, that then feeds the area as North Face and VF Outdoor Campus is doing here in California. Really great objective by a company that wants to be forward-facing and also risk-averse. By looking ahead at policies that might take them in that direction, they're getting a jump on it. So my closing section is on policies and trends. Just want you to know that there's a lot of momentum, and this is a great prelude to what Clay's going to talk about in terms of the drivers and trends and perspective on zero energy and green buildings in the country and in the world, that there's policies moving towards these outcomes of buildings that are going to help you do your work and are going to pull the bigger levers that won't make us have to change every building singularly at a time. This is an example of some of the key policies that are throughout the country, as well as the ZEPI score that rates states by how progressive their policies are to get buildings to zero. I want you to note at the bottom, if you don't already have these terms in your vernacular, they're super prolific is the best word. Electrification and decarbonization, they're displacing zero energy. They're really, I think it's exciting after this longevity for me that energy efficiency is now, the carbon vocabulary is forward facing about why we do this work and what it is we're trying to accomplish. So you're going to see a lot of work about electrification and decarbonization, which are different, of course, because an all electric building is not necessarily a carbon neutral building depending upon its source energy. You'll find in your packet when you get the link to these, this wonderful list that we keep, as well as we keep buildings. MVI both works in policies, changing policies, working on new code development and with cities and states, and we track what's going on so that we can look at the landscape of change in the policy arena. And you can see a number of states are moving towards zero energy, and also in the carbon terminology, you're getting some new carbon policies at the city and county level. So again, because the federal leadership has been very weak, you're picking it up at the state and the cities and counties. So they have the best pulse on their region, and they know how to move politically internally with their region in terms of contractors and parties and building owners to get these renewable policies, zero energy policies, and carbon neutral policies. So this is a great time to punch any questions you have into the box for this section, and we're going to move to Clay's section. and we'll be taking those questions at the end. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kathy. Great presentation, very inspiring. A lot of ambition out there. My name is Clay Nessler. I'm with Johnson Controls, and for a decade we have implemented an energy efficiency indicator study, and it's my pleasure to present the 2018 results. My thanks to NBI for allowing me to present these results on the webinar today, as well as back at the Getting to Zero forum in Pittsburgh last year, where I shared the previous year results. Let's quickly go through a snapshot of the US as well as global highlights. Next slide. So this year we surveyed over 1,900 energy and facility management executives, primarily C-level, vice president, director level, from 20 countries. We expanded the scope of the study because so much of our work is now expanding beyond the developed countries to emerging and developing economies around the world. They are as interested in taking advantage of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and clean energy technologies to address their environmental and economic concerns as the developing world. Next slide. The good news everywhere is that investment is going to increase. If you look to the United States, over on the left, 57% of the organizations we surveyed plan to increase their investment in the next year. The question was, are you going to invest more, the same, or less? And as you can see across the board, there's increased investment everywhere. The highest increased investment is planned for Germany, actually at 83%. But look at China at 70% and India at 52%. In fact, this is a trend which extends around the world. Next slide. So for a decade, we've asked what the key drivers are for investment in energy efficiency and clean energy technologies in buildings. And I must say, for the first 7 or 8 years, it was always cost savings. Energy cost savings ranked very high as very or extremely important, but then it dropped off rather precipitously, and issues like enhanced brand and reputation or attracting employees were pretty much down at the noise level. We have done an effective job as an industry globally making the case that energy efficiency is just not about cost savings. There are multiple benefits. And in fact, you see in this year's survey that in the United States, believe it or not, take a second look, greenhouse gas footprint reduction was the #1 driver of investment in energy efficiency. And that was the second year in a row. Energy cost savings is in fact second, but look at the high relative ratings of energy security, enhancing reputation, investor reporting. So it truly is the case that organizations are making these investments for a variety of different reasons. One more click and we'll see the global results where energy cost savings still dominate it, but again, greenhouse gas footprint reduction is very important. Next slide. We also asked about barriers and challenges. Boy, in energy efficiency, we love talking about challenges because we have so many. Well, what happens is these challenges actually shift over time based on the maturity of the given marketplace. So in the United States, the #1 barrier, and they were asked to choose which one of these barriers is the dominant or the greatest barrier to investment. Uncertainty regarding savings and performance ranked #1 with 1/4 of participants, lack of funding to pay for the improvements, and the lack of technical expertise to execute projects. When we add a bunch of countries from developing and emerging economies, you see a little different result. Click. Yeah, in fact, lack of technical expertise to evaluate the projects is the single greatest barrier, then uncertainty, and then lack of funding. So again, in the United States and Canada and much of Europe, I would say there's understanding of the opportunity, there's awareness, there's technical expertise, but in many parts of the world, that expertise to both evaluate and execute projects is lacking. Next. In the last 12 months. We give them a list of about 30 different improvement measures, and we ask them, did you invest in any of your facility portfolio in this in the last year? Most people get that right because it's top of mind. The more important question, perhaps, is what do you plan to invest in the next 12 months? And this is the first time that building controls improvements has risen to the top of the list. Yes, it's been in the top 5 before, but it's the first time that it's outpaced heating, ventilating, air conditioning, equipment improvements, behavior and education as the top investment going forward. We also have started asking questions related to the integration of different building systems. And what we find interesting is that in the top 10, integration of fire and life safety, integration of security, centralizing of building operations are now gaining top slots. Let's double click on this area of systems integration with the next slide. This is detail on what they're planning to integrate in the next 12 months. And by integration, we mean taking your fire and life safety system and digitally integrating it, exchanging data and taking action with other building systems. For instance, a fire alarm would send a signal to a building control system, which would enter in a sequence for smoke purge, which would talk to the security system for annunciation, which would talk to the lighting system to change the lighting scene, flashing red lights and showing people how to egress from the building. Those are examples of integration. And the systems which are most likely to be integrated in the next year are fire life safety, security, building management, and then finally, more than a third of the organizations are going to integrate lighting and smart equipment into those systems. Next slide. So for better part of a decade, we've asked about some key industry trends. The one that we have the longest data on is green building certification. And the good news here is that trend continues to grow. 19% of organizations in the US have achieved at least one green building certification within their portfolio. 53% plan to achieve that over the coming years, resulting in 72% committed to at least one green building within the portfolio. The next chart, I think, is even more interesting. 44% of organizations now say that they will, they're willing to pay a premium for space in a certified green building. We all know this is a supply and demand issue. If more and more tenants are willing to pay a premium for leased space in a green building, more and more developers will build green buildings. It's a virtuous circle. Globally, these trends are also very significant. Over half plan to have a certified green building, and 51% are willing to pay a premium for space in a certified green building. All positive trends. Next slide. The next question lines up perfectly with the topic of today's webinar. 61% of US respondents are very or extremely likely to have one or more facilities that are nearly zero, net zero, or positive energy or carbon status within the next 10 years. And here you see us struggling to adopt one of the many definitions of zero energy or zero carbon. So we included many to choose from. 61% is an amazingly high number, considering if we had asked this question only 4 years ago, we probably would have been in the single digits. In fact, qualitatively, if we look at our data over the past 5 years, the trend towards net zero energy and carbon buildings is advancing twice as fast as we saw with green building certification. It is, in fact, the key trend driving investment. We also ask about buildings going off the grid and resilience. 54% expect their buildings to be able to operate off the grid for extended periods of time in the next 10 years as well. So whether you call it energy security, resilience, or just independence, that's a key trend. Globally, only Canada, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany have higher likelihoods of having net zero energy or carbon buildings in the next 10 years. So out of 20 countries, US is a strong contender in that race. Next slide. One thing we did this year that we've never done before is we took advantage of the fact that we have symmetrical questions. What did you invest in last year? What do you plan to invest in next year? And we subtract those two things as kind of a momentum indicator. Which are the improvement measures and technologies that are increasing in interest and investment year to year? Building systems integration, as I mentioned before, increased by 23%. So 23% more organizations plan to invest next year than actually did in the previous year. And these arrows highlight, again, the importance of lighting, fire, life safety, smart building equipment, etc. I was going to include a case study here, but Kathy did a great job by already showing one of my favorite buildings, the United Therapeutics Unisphere building in Maryland, which integrates many of the systems and is a net zero energy building. In fact, as we look at trends towards data integrated building systems, we see a very high correlation with net zero and high performance buildings. In the quest towards zero, you have to do things like integrate plug load management, lighting, taking advantage of sophisticated automation and controls. Next slide, please. Another area which is gaining momentum is the centralization of building operations and demand response and demand management. That's very interesting. We've been tracking this forever, but you know, almost 7% of more organizations are going to invest in demand management. My next slide shows one of my favorite case studies of a very sophisticated system to be able to do this. This is one of 7 district or centralized energy plants at Kent State University. They have 3 loops for providing heating and cooling and power to their campus of 90 buildings. They have a combined heat and power plant, which generates 12 megawatts of power across their campus and 13,000 tons of cooling. What's interesting is there's a very sophisticated central control system operating all of these plants, which is based on model predictive control. This is a technology which has been used in the aerospace industry and industrial controls for many, many years, making its way into buildings. And in this case, we actually project the load, electrical, heating, and cooling in every building on campus 7 days advance. We predict the energy prices. We get demand response signals from PJM, the regional ISO serving the plant. And essentially, with data from over 1,000 sensors, 150 control decisions are made every 15 minutes, which optimize the production of energy, the storage of energy, and the use of energy across the campus. One of the interesting things is they're now able to participate in PJM's demand response program with only a 70-minute decision-making period. It used to be they'd have to decide the day before whether they were able to shed load without having good predictions of the conditions in all the buildings. Now they can make that decision automated in 70 minutes before the actual demand response event. This system is saving over $1 million a year on the Kent State campus. Last 2 slides. And of course, of interest to this group, electric storage and on-site renewable energy continue to gain momentum, not surprising, tracking probably the net zero trend. And I'll just close with one final case story, which is Maui College in Hawaii. That'll be the next slide. This is a picture of one of the campus buildings with PV solar on the roof. It also includes PV solar across campus on parking areas and other open spaces here. It's a great story here. The state of Hawaii was the first to commit to net zero energy, net zero carbon by 2045, which has now been followed by California, New York, and other states. The university said that's not ambitious enough. We want to be net zero by 2035. They have 7 campuses in Hawaii. 5 of them have used performance contracting, a pay through savings model, to bring their campuses as close to zero as possible. This particular building is the Maui College. It'll be 100% renewable energy by the end of next year. It did the right steps in the right order. It reduced its energy consumption by 45% initially through energy efficiency. Then it added 2.8 megawatts of solar PV and 13.2 megawatt hours of electric storage. So it'll be at 100%. 4 other campuses in Hawaii will range between 70 to 98% carbon neutral over the next couple of years. And the neat thing about this project is it addresses the barriers that we showed earlier in the survey. The greatest barriers were uncertainty about savings and finance. This project, funded through an energy savings performance contract, guarantees the energy performance of the campuses over a 15-year period, and it's paid for through the energy savings. So taxpayers and ratepayers are not paying for these improvements to the public colleges. They're paid through savings. So it's certainly a replicable model that could apply to net zero aspirational buildings in the US and around the world. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Alexi to conclude the webinar.
Thank you, Clay. That was fascinating and also very inspiring. Great to see such an acceleration of momentum toward higher efficiency, better integration, and better sustainability in the buildings. Straight for all of you on the phone, all 400 or 500, or on the webinar, our new Getting to Zero Buildings database. We have in the past, as Kathy showed, provided static lists every year or every couple years that show progress, and we went from 60 buildings and are now up about tenfold from that in the past 7 years. But now, for the first time, all of that information is available at your fingertips through a live interactive online portal. So this is how you get to it. You can go to the newbuildings.org homepage, and there's a link from there. You can see here on top the URL. It's the Getting to Zero Buildings database, pretty easily found. You can also look at our Zero Energy Hub, and it's accessible through that. So this allows the user to access a treasure trove of information about all the zero energy buildings that we track, and we maintain the most comprehensive list of zero energy buildings across North America. So what I'm going to do here is walk through this tool and show you a couple of use cases and ways that you might be able to use this tool. In order to make sure I don't have any lag or other such problems, these are screenshots. I'm not quite going live, but I just did this yesterday, so it's more or less the same. So I'll scroll down a little from that home page. You can see here's the Getting to Zero Buildings database. There are 2 tabs. The map and list is on the left tab. The analysis is on the right tab. We're going to first look at the map and the list here. There is a map. It shows the number of projects by city across the US and Canada. And then there are filters on the left: ZE status, emerging and verified, states and provinces, and building types. There's also a search box. So I'll walk through a couple of examples of how these things work. So if I scroll down a little more, you get down to the bottom. Here's the list. You can see you can scroll down the list and see all the buildings. Right now, nothing is filtering, so it's showing all 580 some buildings. Now I can click here on the full screen button. That'll take me into full screen. So here we are. I'll be doing the rest of it from here just for simplicity, so you can see a little more of the tool. California has been a leader in zero energy for many years. It was first out of the gate in a lot of ways. In terms of really taking the zero energy idea and running with it. So let's filter for California. What I've done here is clicked on just the state of California. You can see that now we're filtered down on the map as well as on the list for California ZE buildings. If I move the map a little and zoom in, you can see where they are in the state of California. But let's look at schools, because schools have also been a leader in zero energy buildings, as Kathy mentioned, for many years now. So what I've done here is filtered down to just education buildings, and I did that on top of California. So now we're just seeing the education facilities in California, and here's a list of those facilities. Now, if I want to do it another round, I can deselect emerging. Now I'm left with just the verified zero energy performers within the state of California. So there's that. There are those 6 facilities that have demonstrated their performance in California as education facilities. So what I do here is I'm going to go up. I'll click this Reset Filters button up on top. That'll bring me back to the main view. Let's try another use case. What I'm going to do here is hover over Washington, D.C. When I hover over any of these dots, I get this little box, this hover over, and I'll click on it, and that will immediately filter the table for those Washington, D.C. projects. You can see there are 7 emerging projects within Washington, D.C. I'll click outside that box to just bring it back out. And I'll just, for fun, I'll just hover over Oakland because that's where we're going to be at our forum in October. More on that in a little bit. And you can see there are 10 zero energy projects in Oakland, California. Great. Another way you can use this tool is to search. Our friends at DPR Construction have built now 4 different net zero energy offices across the country. So I searched for DPR in the search box and hit enter, and all 4 of those came up as the 4 different DPR offices. When you search, it actually looks through name, certification, city, building type, and I believe state as well. So you could type in Arizona, not just AZ, and it'll search that as well. Hit reset filters. Similarly, I could search for LEED, and this shows me the projects who have LEED entered in that certifications column. And there are, let's see, 132 emerging and 52 verified. So 184 projects with LEED certification at one level or another. You can also click on the table. So if I click on DPR, here we are. This shows within that LEED searched subset. I click on DPR. It shows me where that sits on the map. So I'll go back, reset filters again. And then I'm actually going to go over to this second tab, this analysis tab on the right, up in the upper left corner, analysis. This is a part I'm particularly excited about. This allows you as the user to create your own graphics and charts and to dive into our data set, and gives you the opportunity to explore the information that previously we have provided through these static reports. And now you can do it yourself. So I'll walk through a couple of use cases here. For example, let's say we want to see what's been happening in just the verified building. So I deselected emerging. Now we're just filtered on verified projects. You can see the growth trend. You can see which building types are most common. I'll click back out of that. You can either click on reselect emerging, or you can reset filters up at the top. Either way will get you there. Let's look at office buildings. Office has been a leader and has great potential for getting to zero across the country and across the continent. So I've selected down to just office buildings in the building type filter over here on the left. This shows us some detail. Here's the growth curve, mostly emerging, but quite a few verified projects. You can also hover over. So right here, I'm hovering over this private piece, this purple bar, and that shows me that 61% of office ZE buildings in our database are privately owned. 28% or 36 projects are publicly owned, and there are a few that we don't know. You can do that for any of the fields. So you can hover over the private or public or the building size breakdown. You can hover over any piece of it, and it'll give you the count and a little more info about each piece. So I've reset filters again. Now I'm going to go to New York. We just released a couple weeks ago our Getting to Zero status report, first ever for the state of New York. It's quite detailed. I'm really happy with how it came out. There's a lot of great info in there showcasing the really impressive leadership that the state of New York has taken on zero energy buildings and passive house and high performance buildings. So I'll filter into just state of New York. Here we see there are almost to 30 ZE buildings in the state of New York. Interesting difference here. I'll jump back up. You can either do that by reset filters or by clicking all on building type. Nationally, education and office lead. In New York, multifamily is in the lead. It's an interesting difference and is not terribly surprising considering the high penetration of multifamily housing in especially New York City. But that's an interesting difference there. Reset filters again. And let's take one last piece here. Let's look at the largest ZE buildings and see what's driving those and what are some of the trends we can see in those. Over 50,000 square feet. So I've selected just 50K to 100K and over 100,000 square foot buildings. You can see they're largely public, lots of education facilities. And if I dive in a little more, seeing as how there are lots of education, we can get an idea. Okay, look, there are 63 out of 70 of those facilities are publicly owned education. So schools or other education, pretty large buildings. I think that gives you a pretty good idea of what some of the things you can do with this. And I'm excited to be able to offer to all of you on the webinar today the opportunity to take this thing and run with it. So I hit escape to get out of that full screen view. Now I'm back at the home page there. I'm actually gonna do one last thing as a demo, zoom in on the state of Oregon, my home state. Oregon has been a leader in ZE out of proportion to its relatively small population on a national stage. So that's been good to see. And so I've filtered down to the state of Oregon, and now I'll just scroll all the way down. You can hit this download button on the bottom right, and that gives you the opportunity to take this data. So let's say, well, not the back-end data, but the graphics and the analysis. You can say, how about a PowerPoint? It takes a minute to process, and then it generates a PowerPoint file. So we encourage you to use this resource. Use it in your presentations, use it in your work and your reports, use it to accelerate the zero energy buildings market and to get more buildings to zero. Do be sure to credit properly when you use. So for example, New Buildings Institute accessed May 2019, or whenever it is that you accessed this. And of course, it's live, it's updating all the time. So this is accessible 24/7, and more buildings are coming online quickly with the momentum that both Kathy and Clay gave us a good rundown on. So I'm excited to keep an eye on this and to share further developments as they come up through this and through other venues. One way that we make sure that we are providing as much utility in this resource and in some of our other work as possible is by trying to be as comprehensive as we possibly can in tracking all the zero energy buildings across North America. So what's your number? Where do you sit on that list? If you have a building or you know of a building, if you're poking around on here, you see, hey, there's a gap, or a project needs some data update. I know something new about this, who knew energy data, or my project isn't on the list. Well, let's get it on the list. You can go to our project registry. You can see the link there, newbuildings.org/project-registry, and submit your project information, get your project on the list. Last thing I'll mention, NBI offers a lot of free resources and conducts events. So for example, here is a selection of some of our resources on zero energy buildings, on specific sectors like multifamily, or on specific technologies like rooftop unit HVAC efficiency, or some of these more tech specific pieces. We offer all these guides for free. They are available on our website. There's a ton of info from tech-specific focus stuff to project guidance that will help you get to zero in your own projects. Oh, okay. And we encourage you to join us for the Getting to Zero Forum in October 9th through 11th in Oakland, California. This will be a great event. Some of the most impactful research and projects and leadership will be on display, and the trends that are accelerating zero energy buildings nationally and internationally will be, some of the leaders pushing those trends will be at this event. So please join us in October in Oakland for the Getting to Zero Forum. And now I believe we can go to Q&A with the time we have left.
Okay, we're going to start out with a question. Is this residential or commercial buildings that were highlighted today? And is there a breakdown?
NBI has historically focused on commercial and multifamily buildings from 4 units on up. The database that I just showed is commercial and multifamily, and the trends that Kathy showed are also commercial and multifamily. Clay, I don't know if you have an answer on that, although I assume it's mostly commercial.
Yeah, it's commercial, institutional, and industrial facilities.
We will be having, we'll be working with our partners, the Net Zero Energy Coalition, NZEC, to introduce their 2018 inventory of net zero homes. single family residential, plus some carryover into multifamily actually. And that should be coming out in June or July. So stay tuned for that. I don't think we have a date set right this very minute, but there should be an announcement coming out about that pretty soon.
Okay, do we have a percentage of the renovated versus new for these buildings?
Yes, we don't get that information on every building. Sometimes our sources are in a news article or something and you can't find a contact person, but approximately of these buildings, 25% of the buildings are major renovations and 75% of the buildings are new construction.
Okay, and how many of these ZEBs are also including battery storage?
Great question. We would love to know that. We don't, our pulse in this field is pretty good and not very many yet. It's more noteworthy when they are, so they tend to profile that, and we've only seen it in a handful so far, like the project Clay mentioned at the Kent State University. But it hasn't been an inquiry on our submission form until recently. We're just recently added, is this building all electric? And we're going to add the question, we're adding the question regarding, does it include storage?
Yeah,
so I'd say very few to date, I would guess.
It was encouraging to see in that regard the momentum that Clay pointed out on the energy storage component of the survey, that companies were increasing the investment in storage. Did I categorize that right, Clay?
Yeah, maybe I could just jump in there. I mean, what was striking about the University of Hawaii projects is the ratio of energy storage to PV. You know, Maui College is 2.8 meg of PV, but 13.4 megawatt hours of energy storage. And there's a very simple explanation for that. There's no net metering in Hawaii. So while it may be more cost effective in most locations in the United States to essentially use the grid as storage, right? Selling your PV to the grid and then using it off the grid at night or when there are inadequate renewable resources at the time, that's really not an option in Hawaii. So people are doubling down on energy storage. If they're going to use energy at night or when the sun isn't shining, which by the way isn't very often in Hawaii, but they need to add the storage. So I think it's somewhat driven by cost and also driven by government policy and regulatory policy. So something to look for as you see the expansion of these zero energy buildings.
Okay. So this is more of a technical question. With the limited roof space, it's difficult for skyrise buildings to reach ZE. What percentage of ZE projects are more than 3 stories? Are we tracking that? And then how do you recommend addressing these type of projects?
That is something we try to track as much as we can. I would say in the database, we have a relatively limited window into just how tall each individual project is, or each building is. One thing I have been noticing is that there's definitely a trend toward, maybe you could think of it as maybe a broader view of zero energy. So more community solar, more portfolio approaches, more projects that are taking on a district or a campus approach that may include solar on their roof, as well as, for example, in the VF Outdoor project, there was a picture there and you could see that there was solar on the roof, but it was also on all of the parking area covers, the canopies for the parking zones. So we're seeing larger buildings trying to get to zero, setting these aggressive goals and achieving them, and in part that is through more community solar and more options, taking putting it all out on the table.
Okay, well, I'm going to end off with our last question, which is the most popular question we get. Yes, you will get a follow-up email tomorrow with a copy of the slides and a link to the on-demand recording, along with the resources, the database, and the Johnson Controls study. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you again to our panelists. Have a nice day.